Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living landscapes around us and within us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature, where we explore ways to root down intimately with the land, ecosystems, communities, and practices that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we remember to belong in.
I live in Llandysul in Shir Aberteifi. A letter informed me my uncle was dead. To go with cyflymder by train up to Llundain. Os can oedd o bennoedd was left me 'twas sad.
Adding that layer of culture or song onto the landscape has brought it alive. It transformed my home valley really from a place that I already felt connected to, sort of to the natural world. It added a cultural layer of connectivity to me. So now when I walk through that landscape, it has a real significance and depth to it. So song and culture can really bring a landscape alive in that sense, and it brings a sense of story and a sense of belonging to a place, wherever you might be.
Cynefin is the creative vision of West Wales native folk musician Owen Shiers. Fascinated by music and history, it is a bid to give a modern voice to Ceredigion rich yet neglected cultural heritage. Starting out from his home village of Capeldewi in the Cletŵr Valley of Wales and travelling through the local musical landscape, Owen has unearthed seasoned songs and stories, some that have never before been recorded, and given them new life in the present moment. The result of 3 years' research and work, his debut album, Dylan Avon, Following a River, is distinct both in its concept and ambition. From talking animals and tragic train journeys to the musings of star-crossed lovers, farm workers, and lonely vagabonds, the album provides a unique window into the past and to a vibrant oral culture of story and song. It moves, probes, and reveals forgotten aspects of the tradition whilst raising questions around our modern malaise of disconnection and rootlessness. I actually went to school in Ceredigion and grew up in the neighbouring county Sir Benfro, Pembrokeshire in Wales. So speaking with Owen stirred my inner hiraeth. Now Owen might cringe at my attempt to translate hiraeth, which is an old Welsh or even Proto-Celtic word, but from what I've found, it speaks to a spiritual longing for a home to which you cannot return, or a yearning for a home which maybe never was. The nostalgia, the grief for lost place, or the echo of ancient places from the soul's past. In a way, it's our longing to belong and a sense of once belonging. It can be in the wind, the rocks, the moss, the landscapes lost. And perhaps Cynefin roots that longing into its original home or habitat. Cynefin is another beautiful old Welsh word which Owen breaks down for us in this episode, as it is the ethos and practice he has decided to sculpt his music and life around. As any of you who've listened to the podcast for a while now will know, belonging is a big theme within our work at Rooted Healing. And yet Owen brings a humble and fresh perspective on the idea that we can create our own belonging. He roots belonging back into the true sense of Cynefin and ruminates on a lot of themes worth sitting with at a deep level. I especially enjoy the questioning around our responsibilities in the protection and revival of diversity in the broadest ecological sense that involves culture, language, and story, which is a big theme that we're exploring in our online course, Deepen Your Roots, and at our upcoming gathering, Ancestral, which is the 23rd till 28th of July in Eryri, North Wales. So it is especially joyful to bring Owen onto the show as we approach this time in community on my home soil. Hiraeth feels so alive in this modern culture of dissociative sensibilities and disconnect, and our work is arising from this deep longing. Francis Weller, who you'll know from previous episodes is one of my favourite authors, he observes that somewhere deep in our bones lies an old intuition that we arrive here within Earth carrying a bundle of gifts to offer to our community. And the human experience was long rooted in this village life, nestled in the rest of nature, full of craft, stories, more than human kinship, and this kind of tactile intimacy with the world. Life is designed to be imaginative, sensuous, and full of wonder. Instead, we come into a strange, industrialized world where lies our diminished experience of who we truly are. There are some Indigenous communities, for example, who listen to the children share about their dreams every morning as a way to understand the health of their village and land. And there is perhaps some part of our soul that expects the eyes of the elders to peer down at us in the morning asking, "So, what did you dream?" There is a part of us that expected songs that praise the land and sky, foods that come straight from the forest and sea, deep connection that tells our body and soul we belong. Amidst such harrowing, collective sorrows, it feels ever more potent to embody this original village, so that we can remember this blueprint of existence and reorient ourselves collectively towards a rooted revolution. And so Ancestral is a time for ancient innovation to bring deep healing to our inner and outer landscapes. And the alchemy of Welsh rainforests, rushing river, mystical lake, roundhouse councils, fireside stories, folkloric foraging and ancestral foods from the hearth will reverberate through your being, bringing insight into what it means to be interrelated and how we can become rooted ancestors for our future generations. It's a time of profound connection, digital unplugging, deep listening, and a radical presence with your Indigenous soul and the spirits of the land. Visit rootedhealing.org/ancestral to learn more. And I'm excited to also announce that we have a gift forward scheme with a recent gift from a past participant who can fund a full place at Ancestral. So if you're someone who has never had access to a healing retreat experience, please do reach out to us with what you believe this gift could bring you. Alongside this episode, Owen is gifting our Patreon community a Ceredigion folk song map, which he has put together with the Aberystwyth artist Peter Stevenson. And it's inspired by a map he saw in his time in Africa, where there were all the melodies for the kora with the village and origin noted alongside. And so he's got 25 notable folk songs from the county in West Wales, each illustrated and located in the towns and villages where they were originally sourced or born. So it's a really beautiful giveaway, especially if you're interested in Welsh ancestry or folk songs in general. It's a beautiful way to re-inhabit our landscapes. I hope you find nourishment and food for thought from this lovely conversation with Owen Shiers, as well as from his music, which has been woven throughout the episode. I began, as usual, by inviting Owen to honour an aspect of the land that shaped him and to also invite in a being into the conversation in spirit.
The Cletor River itself, and one of the tributaries of the Cletor River, which is the Einon, which runs past a family home. And so I guess I grew up being soothed to sleep by the sound of her waters, I should say, maybe. It's still, even to this day, a source of comfort to me. It's like that just eternal sound that's just been there my whole life, really. People would sometimes come and stay and think it was raining because of the sound of the stream, but you kind of get used to it. I mean, I live next to a stream here. Rivers and streams have been a real source of comfort, offered a kind of permanence, maybe.
Ar lannau afon cletwr yn blentyn maged fi, a chys fysi o'i gysgu yn sŵn nid y froedd hi. Ac yno bym yn chwarae yn blentyn nwyfus iach, a cheisio dal bryth y llod yn credu ei cletwr fach. Mae dŵr yn troi melynau wrth fyned ar ei hynt, a rhod y ffatri hefyd fel yn y dyddiau gynt. Ymysg y brain ar eithin, mae'n tarddu ar y rhos, a llif y blodau gwylltion o gylch ei ddwylan blos. A phan naw dydd fy nghladdu, torwch fy meddrod i, ger dwylan a fo'n cletwr, yn sŵn nid y froedd hi.
Who am I calling in? Ti'n siarad Cymraeg?
Tymyd bach.
Tymyd bach, ti'n deall yn iawn. Dwi'n mynd i enwi a galw mewn ceffylau gwyllt cwm cymere, a ceffylau sy'n byw i slaw o ben Caragopa. So this is more relative to where I'm living now, because we have wild horses here. They could be literally 20 meters away. I don't know, I can't see through the wall, but they come quite close. So I'd say the horses that we have here, I think they're half Carneddau, half Cobs. They're pretty feisty. You know, they're very curious. We try and keep an eye out for them as well, because it's tough. You know, the uplands here are not the most bountiful in terms of things to eat for them. So,
did you grow up speaking Welsh with your family?
A bit with my family. It's a strange paradox. My dad's from Cardiff, but doesn't speak much Welsh. My mum's from England and speaks Welsh. I learnt the majority of my Welsh in Ysgol Feithrin, which is the Welsh sort of nursery system. So I have no memory of learning it, really. I was very young. And at the same time, my mum decided to learn Welsh.
I'm intrigued by your song collecting within Ceredigion, as it's also where I grew up. And I know you left Wales for about 10 years, but then decided to return, even though you had to, quote, face some ghosts. And this feels like a big theme in our generation, the scattering and then the longing to come home, but the complications that often come with that. So what brought you back, and with such richness, into local culture? And how has your sense of belonging changed through the process?
It seems to me that more than any other time in human history, we are constantly haunted by the ghost of possibility, especially with, you know, social media and growing up in a very isolated, quiet, rural place with not much stimulation. As a teenager, very naturally, I wanted to get the hell out of there. Well, I say now I didn't have the stimulation that I thought I wanted, but I think, you know, it's a natural part of adolescence, which is to step outside your own culture and your own family story and your life up until that point, and try to see it or experience it from a different perspective. And I think for me that involved leaving Wales. And I remember actually my first day at university, I went to Bath to do music, and you know, you just sort of meeting your housemates, and people were saying, "Oh, you speak Welsh?" And I was like, "Yeah." Like, it was completely normal for me to speak Welsh. Everybody I knew spoke Welsh, pretty much. And yet, I suddenly, for the first time, had this appreciation of, like, well, that's quite unusual, you know, in a British, kind of wider British context. And so that was the first time I remember suddenly having an appreciation for my upbringing. That kind of grew over my time out of Wales. After I left uni, I ended up working for a small label, which involved a lot of music which was indigenous to specific countries. So I was really exposed to people not only playing the music of the place, they were telling the story of that place through their music. And I think a light bulb kind of went off for me, because I was, up until that point, my music making didn't have that element. It was personal in the sense that I would write songs that were for my own experience, but it didn't speak to a wider culture, really. I wasn't writing in Welsh either, I was writing in English. That was really the beginning of the journey back, I think. That added to my own appreciation, really, of my growing appreciation for my upbringing and my own culture. I think the other really critical thing that happened was I ended up working for a charity down in Devon called Embacombe, and I had mentors there, some really quite pivotal mentors, a chap called Matt McCartney, a woman called Juliet Bagler, and another chap called Jonathan Snell, who really asked me very difficult questions, the kind of questions that your culture doesn't ask you, or your family doesn't ask you, or certainly your education system won't ask you. Questions like, what do you love? What are your gifts? What are your responsibilities? Which is, a very loaded question, which helped me turn back home, because a lot of the work that Mackin specifically does is bringing people back to their indigeneity. And after that, it was a kind of inevitable thing, I think, that I would come back to Wales. But I came back a very different person and a bit more grown up, I would hope, and with a very different perspective and appreciation for the place I grew up in, and suddenly was able to see it through very different eyes.
Pan oeddwn arfor ei ddydd, radio mas o'n cafydd, cyfarfod neith y madau farch yn ymgon ar y mynydd, yn ymgon ar y mynydd. Dywedau y cylgwana nawr wrth y ceffyl crafa, fe fi mi'n dydd yn fy mharch yn cystal marchath eithe, yn cystal marchath eithe.
In some ways, this is a critical part of that homecoming journey, which is addressing the reason you left in the first place. It's a really common element of Western civilization, because the kind of founding story of Western civilization is that of displacement. And so ending that means stopping the flight. And for me, in a way similarly to you, I didn't have a great experience at secondary school. I was a bit of an outsider. I was the only person in my year doing art at A level. I had like long hair, and everyone was calling me a hippie and jippo, and really quite derogatory stuff. There is a backwardsness to West Wales as well, and so because of that, I think I'd really rejected a lot of. I just could have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, basically. And so when I came back, there were these there were ghosts from my past who were, in the next village, who I'd kind of hoped I'd never see again. And then also there was, I think for me, being an artist and making work publicly then in the Welsh language, which was the first time I had really done that since I was in school, had an element of facing the judgment of that community. And was I, rolling all my R's and doing my pronunciation, this silly things that you worry about when you're recording songs. There was all that to contend with, which was sort of stuff I never thought I would have to contend with, I guess, when I left. And then there's also things like adjusting to life where you're not in an urban centre and you're not being surrounded by loads of stimulus. You have to start creating your own networks and your own, this thing of deriving your own sense of meaning from your locality and hanging out with people of different generations. You're not just hanging out with people at your own age. You need to spend time visiting the old lady next door who needs a shopping doing, or it's just things like that which actually become really critical when you move back into a rural area. I think there's quite a shift that has to happen there when you come back to a place from your past that maybe you thought you wouldn't have to come back to, or that can be challenging. I think there were ghosts there for me. to a degree they're still there, but I feel more comfortable now having faced them. In general, people have just been delighted by what I've been doing, and it's kind of gone better than I ever thought. So as in life, the kind of fear you have is completely in proportionate to actually what's there, and often when you kind of broach the fear, amazing things happen.
Yes, a lot of resonance there. You've written about the idea that it is a misconception that we can be the masters of our own belonging. Can you speak to this, and also how Cynefin has perhaps become your own activism in this?
I think for me there has to be space for something other than you in that equation. I think it comes down to that, really. And then maybe there's a question here, this idea of responsibilities. I mean, duty is a very heavy word, but the idea that you're not beholden just to yourself in this equation, I think is an important one to take into consideration. I'm just going to park that a minute, and I'll just address the word Cynefin, because I'll try and bring them back together. The word Cynefin, it doesn't really have a direct translation into English. A bit like hiraeth, it's quite hard to explain. The closest I would say in terms of an English word would be something like habitat. And what's significant, I think, about the word habitat is that it has the word habit in it. Cynefin comes from, as far as we know, it's originally a farming term. So if you observe the ways that animals move through the landscape, the trails they make through repetition and through habit, those are cynefinoedd. Cynefin is the sense that you have, or an animal has, of connectedness or familiarity with where it is, or its home territory, you could say. Cynefin is not something that it's not something that pops up overnight. It's wrought through repetition and through habit. As hunter-gatherers, we would need to know our Cynefin and observe the Cynefins of animals in order to hunt them. So I see it really as it's a skill as much as it is a phenomena. It's something you have to practice. And so with that regard, I've come to understanding really sort of invitation to stop. I don't see how you can practice Cynefino without stopping. That's the first act of the skill, is to stay put in one place. And then the second part is to start listening and observing. When we moved to Capel Dewi, the locals said, well, you'll be newcomers here for 30 years. So that gives you a sort of inclination of the time spans we're talking about here.
Among the Celts, Ellen Helena was the goddess of ancient tracks, perhaps of Cynefin itself. And she was considered the first and oldest of all deities whose animals followed her tracks and used them to find suitable places to sleep and give birth. And so this concept of deep habitation feels truly ancient and sacred to our ancestors.
Well, I'd not come across that, so thank you. That's really interesting. You've made me think of transhumanism, because there is within Welsh culture, Welsh farming culture, transhumanism was a real thing. They got the Hafod on the Hendre system of moving the livestock up to the hills in the summer and bringing them back down in the winter, and that was a real part of that. And so the sense of Cynefin was more expanded, because people were moving with the animals. And from that, actually, we get the word heft in English. So the idea that animals were hefted to a place whereby they were shepherded for a period of time to stop them roaming from common land or from the hill, for example. And then after a period of time, they wouldn't need that shepherding anymore. They would remember their heft or their Cynefin. And then that memory would get passed down generation to generation. And there's, I think, in the some parts of the Peak District, the hefted sheep are recognised as part of the heritage of the Peak District because of the unique kind of intergenerational Cynefino that's happened with the sheep there. Regardless of what you think about sheep, I think it's a really interesting idea of belonging, that once you stop, that then gets transmitted. And I think that maybe weaves a little bit back into your question about the master of your own belonging, because culturally speaking, you inherit a lot of it. If you're in an intact culture, by the time you reach adolescence, it's too late. You're so steeped in it, it would be unthinkable to leave it. For me, the idea that you're the master of your own belonging is a very Western, almost sort of liberalist concept, really, which in some ways is at odds with how Indigenous people come to know and inhabit a place.
Yeah. I would love to dig into this idea of responsibility.
I think when I came back to Wales, it was the first time I'd encountered that. I think previous to that, I really felt like I could just do whatever the fuck I wanted, go travelling. I was sort of in that sort of master of my own destiny phase, I guess. And it was the first time I felt the pull of, okay, there's kind of work for me here, and it's not about me. And I think particularly it's true for anyone who finds themselves from a minority culture or a minority people which is constantly being eroded at or under threat. And the more, I think, politically aware I became about the precarity of my own culture, but also, minority peoples worldwide and languages, and witnessing with, the sixth great mass extinction, it's a systemic issue essentially, which is affecting not just biodiversity and wildlife, but peoples and languages and cultures. And once I started to joining those dots, it started making sense for me that my work really needed to be rooted in that, and my sense of place needed to be rooted in being in service to something that was greater than just my own kind of gratification. And that, for me, has given me a sense of meaning far beyond what I think I would have been able to have just conjured by myself. And the word responsibility comes into that. It's still a choice. I could have chosen not to taken on that. I don't think I would have been as fulfilled or as happy, but there was something else outside of me that came into my awareness that wasn't from me. And and it sounds a bit mystical, but that's how I experienced it. And as soon as I kind of accepted that, stuff started falling into place and chance meetings happened. And I kind of went on this whole journey that I never, ever would have expected to have gone on. And that has given me, I feel like, a real sense of belonging and meaning and purpose. And I also don't want to romanticize that, because it's hard work. It's because responsibilities also have limitations by nature of the word, in a sense. And so, if you've sort of tasked yourself or been tasked with trying to be kind of cultural stewards, you're looking at loss on a daily basis. You're really on the kind of front line of the tides of cultural homogenization that are happening. Housing crises, language loss. There's immense loss happening all the time. So you can't, unless you're awake to that, you can't respond accordingly.
Aderin di sy'n rhodio'n gledydd, o ti awyr ar hyn ar newydd, roedd wedi gyngor I fachgenyn, sydd yn cerio esgwyll na blwyddyn. Yr ynys bachgenyn gwrando, gael gwybod beth sydd yn ddyflino, pa un ar byd sy'n troi'n derbyn, neu chyrio'r wyt am gariad rhywun.
To break it up, response ability. So this, how do we respond? Really, that's the question, I think, given what we know.
In a way, it is finding our mythopoetic calling, the one that is in service to the greater ecosystem in the broadest sense, including the human story and the diversity within it, which arises from the question, what is our role as members of a dominant culture that homogenizes land and people into monocultures? How can we be enriching members of our ecosystem?
What's our role? I think in some ways maybe it's as simple as maintaining the diversity that's already here and trying to increase it if possible. Like you said, we are, the whole the dominant force of Western culture is that, it essentially is hostile to anything that it's not itself.
Yeah.
And so we really have to champion diversity in the face of that. And that in itself is a life's work, I feel.
Yeah.
I think it's important not to be too ambitious maybe sometimes, and just recognise really what we're up against.
You've talked about Cymraeg having a somatic virality. Is that even how you say that word?
Yes, I think so. I've only ever written it down. I've never said it out loud.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I've really sat with that and tried it on. And you've also quoted Stefan Jenkinson, quote, "Old languages seem to understand themselves to be the sound that their home ground makes," end quote. And this piece of diversity and what's alive and arising from the landscape and how we tend to it feels really alive in your work. So I'd love to hear you speak about the Welsh language in general and your reclamation of these roots.
Well, it's a very old language for people that maybe don't know. It's the second oldest language in Europe. There's a real diversity to it. Again, this is maybe something that I've grown to appreciate maybe later in life. Growing up, we had this joke of like we couldn't understand the Gogs. The Gogs are the people from North Wales. And we'd take the piss out of each other, we were the Hunters and they were the Gogs, and we'd struggle to understand them. But since then, I've come to appreciate there's not just, north and south, there's east and west, there's little linguistic enclaves in places. And I've become fascinated by, we have lots of different words for different things in Wales. Some things might have, 4 or 5 different words. And actually, interestingly, where I am now, which is sort of mid Wales on the coast, Eglwys Fach, which is the nearest village, is the linguistic threshold where South Wales becomes Gog, because the people in Eglwys Fach would go to the market in Aberystwyth, and north of Eglwys Fach, so the next village is Derwen Las, they go to Machynlleth to the market. That's my theory. But then if you go east from Machynlleth, you've got Dinas Mawddwy, and they've got a whole other thing going on. They like Cerbech Les, just like very nasal thing going on. And then if you go north of Machynlleth and you go over Cadair Idris, which is a very formidable mountain, you get to Dolgellau, which is different again. And so you can really see in that how the mountain itself has formed a kind of linguistic barrier. So back in the day, you'd need a really good reason to want to walk over the mountain, basically.
Yeah.
And so you get these linguistic niches in various places, and sort of linguistic identities, and what's tafodiaeth in English? I've forgotten now. Dialects, that's it. So dialects, local dialects, and then I can look across the estuary here. I can see Aberdyfi across the estuary. So it's like a mile away over the estuary, but they sound completely different because, again, the estuary is quite dangerous to cross. So there wasn't an awful lot of, you have to go the whole way up the estuary and back down the other side to meet someone from Eglwys Fach. So I love all that stuff. It's just absolutely fascinating to me. And so in places, it's really observable how the landscape itself has basically isolated people, pockets of dialects and terminology. And then through that sort of fascination, I've come to start making a very conscious effort to note down and remember dialects and words for things, especially sort of where I'm from in Ceredigion, because there's a whole lexicon that belongs to an older way of life, things like agricultural terminology, which is kind of passing from memory now because of mechanization and because people aren't doing things with their hands or making crafts. So I've been making a more conscious effort to sort of learn these words, because often the old generation don't really realise what they've got. And so I spend a lot of time just interviewing and hanging out with old people, basically. And that's become a real source of enjoyment and learning for me. And it's a strange thing sometimes to be able to say to someone, to show an appreciation, but just to say to them, do you realize like what you've got, the rarity of what they're holding maybe, and to kind of, it can be sort of sad and also sort of maybe not validating, but uplifting for them to have someone who's a bit younger come and actually show interest in something they might think is not very important, or you really get a sense of just how diverse it is when you start delving into it. And I love the game of like guessing where people are from. Like sometimes to the village, it's that diverse still in places. I mean, it's becoming less diverse all the time, obviously.
Yeah, wasn't it less than 100 years ago that children were quite brutally punished for speaking Welsh at school?
Yeah, so my grandmother's generation were probably the last generation who experienced, they called it the Welsh Not, which was, I think it ended in around the war. And it was essentially, came from the establishment attitude that Welsh was something which was holding people back, especially in educational terms. And so there was no educational provision in the Welsh language. It was all in English. And children who were often monoglot Welsh speakers. And I have to say also, to this day, there are kids who will turn up at primary school not able to speak English, and up until the age of 6 or 7, they might not have much English at all, which is great. But back in the day, that was really frowned upon. And so it was literally beaten out of them. So they weren't allowed to speak their mother tongues. And anybody caught speaking Welsh in school or the playground had a board on a piece of string hung around them. And whoever was wearing that at the end of the day was caned. And so there was this horrible culture of kids snitching on each other as well because they didn't want to wear the Welsh Not. So, it's pretty dark. And that came to it, I think, about around 1940 was the last sort of instance of it. But of course, just because they stopped beating out of people doesn't mean that the attitudes changed, just became less acceptable. So, it wasn't really until the 1980s that whole attitude really sort of did a 180 and people started, it was a lot more investment in Welsh language education.
I have a lot of grief that I didn't become fluent in Welsh because it wasn't spoken at home. My mum was English, but my granddad was Welsh. He was from Aberystwyth, although I never got to meet him.
It's not too late.
Yeah, I know. It's a big question in my heart as I'm called back to the West Coast, and that's a plan in motion. I think it would be a deeply healing ancestral reclamation to re-immerse in Welsh culture and language. I struggled with it at school and I received a fair amount of exclusion. I really understand where it comes from, but because I was the daughter of an English woman, I wasn't let in on a lot of the Welsh things, such as Eisteddfod or Dawns y Blodau, or learning violin or the harp at school. That was only for the Welsh children. So there's a piece of me that feels like I wasn't allowed or permitted to be Welsh by the Welsh. And at the same time, I want to reclaim those roots because the land there, it's the biggest grief I hold, is the loss of our farm and the deep, intimate connection I had with that land and the culture that also rose from it. In fact, it was the house share you're in that actually led me to your work. Are you still living there?
I live in a land-based housing co-op.
Yes, which sounds like such a beautiful way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a musician, so, I haven't got a cat's chance in hell of getting a mortgage ever. So I've been forced to find alternative ways of living forever, really. But I also makes sense to me to live communally. I think that's a way of life which really appeals to me and makes sense in terms of the way we share resources and share our lives. So that said, it's very strange. My parents still have a family home, and I really appreciate the sadness you expressed in missing your family home. There's still, if I'm being totally honest, there's still a strange cultural thing, I think, around living with your parents. And I know loads of Welsh farmers who live with their parents. It's just the family farm. And the idea of sending your grandmother off to a home just doesn't happen. And that's how people have existed forever. Certainly recently we've invented care homes. It's interesting challenging those ideas of the nuclear family in the modern sense, and this idea that every child should have their own property and their own washing machine and their own car, and then they all get scattered to the four winds, and the parents are left on their own. I think that's really sad as well, and I think that's part of this sense of dislocation and scatteredness. So I'm not too far away from my folks, and that feels really good. It's a much harder thing to reconcile when you haven't got the base, the kind of mothership, as it were.
Yeah. You've spent a lot of time with elders, and I really love this. I've also interviewed Sam Lee, and he's another song collector, and this courage to immerse intergenerationally and also cross-demographically. It's so needed. You've asked the question, what happens when a people stay put in one place long enough for it to begin to speak through them? So what have you noticed to happen?
My idea of what constitutes an elder has shifted a lot in the last few years. I think previously it might have been someone who I would have pedestaled, or even someone who might have cast themselves as an elder, or had that certain gravitas around them. And those I'm not denying there are people of that kind of age and stature who have a lot to share, but I think I've begun to seek it out in more unlikely places and people. In some ways, everyone's got wisdom, and maybe sometimes they don't realize it. And so I find myself more and more sort of tasking myself with drawing out people, not in a like capitalist extractist way, just sort of just asking questions really, and genuinely being curious about people's life story and what they think about things. And it's kind of amazing what comes back. And the other thing I think for me is it's not just about getting stuff. It's not just about, accumulating wisdom or knowledge or whatever. It's really about the quality of time I spend with them. And there's something for me I notice more and more, particularly with the older generation. They're very generous with their time, and they're never in a hurry. And in a way, that's been a real teacher for me recently. Is this? We had a guy come up here to do our track, digger driver, and he's 73 or 74, Edwards. Really lovely, gentle, learned, sprightly man. And he'd come in, I say, come and have a cup of tea, or come for lunch. And we'd be there for 2 hours in the middle of the working day, just chatting about everything, philosophy, plants, history, everything. And when he got back in the digger, he would work like an animal, but he didn't, there was none of this like watching the clock. Oh, I've got to be at this meeting. I've got a Zoom, we're on a Zoom call. You know what I mean? Like this busyness really, I think that's such a sort of affliction really in the West. And so I think that's one of the things I really get from who I would consider elders is sort of the pace, the sense of slowness. And so it's a quality, I think, for me that people embody as much as it is what they say or what they think. And sometimes that can come from people who I have complete, my politics are at the other end of the spectrum to theirs. I think it's being curious about everyone, and then just being open.
Yeah. So how has this woven into your music? What has come up for you through this journey of finding these old folk songs and really embodying them, sharing them and celebrating them? Because what I found so beautiful about old folk songs is how they have this ability to weave us back into the landscape and back into our collective human heart in a humble way, a way that feels so natural.
Well, Tom Waits has this saying, every song needs an address. Many of the songs I've picked up, I can locate to, not only specific villages, but specific people and specific cottages, or, so for me, adding that layer of culture or song onto the landscape has brought it alive. And so it transformed my home valley really from a place that I already felt connected to in a sort of, in the sense of the natural world. It added a cultural layer of connectivity to me. So now when I walk through that landscape, a specific place, even though I haven't met necessarily the person that composed the song, has a real significance and depth to it. And so I think song and culture can really bring a landscape alive in that sense, and it brings a sense of story and a sense of belonging to a place wherever you might be. And so that the river thing was, I guess, accidental in a way, but rivers are carriers of culture. But human culture has popped up alongside rivers for thousands of years, because rivers obviously provide food, but they also transport things. And so it's no accident really that lots of human culture can be found up and down rivers. Dilyn Afon, which is the album, that was the idea really, was sort of starting out from the Aenon and moving out from there up the river and seeing what I found. Yeah, it's brought a whole a new dimension to my relationship with where I live. And I think also the other really lovely thing about it has been being able to reflect back to people the importance of what they were carrying, particularly with people who I've learnt songs from orally. I'm sure Sam will tell you this, like sometimes they don't realise what they've got. And so being able to sort of just show that appreciation, it has felt really important at times.
And I love the album cover. Is that you with the coracle?
Yes.
Have you spent much time in one?
I did when I was younger. There was a chap called Bernard Thomas who was a famous coracle chap, and he used to take kids out with him. But I'm not skilled enough to... I mean, to be honest, that photo was taken in January, which is the time you don't want to be going in January. I need to spend more time. It's a really hard thing to steer, actually.
Yeah, I've been in one. For my brother's birthday, we bought him a coracle making workshop.
Oh, wow.
So I've been in his with my niece, and steering is, wow, it's immensely difficult.
You managed to stay dry?
We did. We chose a bit of the river where there were shallow bits so we could catch ourselves, as it really felt like we could just... They live in East Anglia, and it felt like we could just end up in Cambridge in no time. It's a very dreamy, ancestral experience.
Yeah, I mean, they are the oldest form of floating, vessels, aren't they, really? And certainly in Wales, they go back thousands and thousands of years. And especially on the Tyvi River, they're a real iconic site. Probably not going to last much longer by the looks of things, but certainly the fishing side of things.
Well, to close, what's alive for you? Any final threads to weave in to leave people with?
What's really present for me right now is bridge building. You mentioned previously that you didn't feel maybe welcome into Welsh culture. I wasn't from a Welsh-speaking house, a pure Welsh-speaking house, and in some ways I understand the kind of defensiveness of any Indigenous community who's just trying to protect their way of life, but that closed offness can really shoot themselves in the foot. And I think there's a real it can be quite bucolic and quite closed off in Wales sometimes. And so a lot of the work I've been trying to do is bring the Welsh-speaking community and the English-speaking incoming community together, because they don't speak to each other very much, and the English speakers aren't going anywhere. We do really have to learn to coexist. And I guess my invitation to anyone who feels called to learn Welsh would be to go for it and really go for it, not just dabble, because it takes a lot of perseverance and dedication. And my invitation to the Welsh-speaking community would be to reach out and invite people. Don't just stick with what you know, because it's really important. Rural Wales needs people who are bringing in ideas and innovative ways of thinking, and it's very easy to stay in stasis when you're just sort of defending yourself and you're in that kind of brace position, culturally speaking. So, it's really, really important. I think that Wales and Welsh culture is able to receive external ideas and obviously maintain its own identity and its own culture at the same time. So that would be my kind of parting wish.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. We offer nature-led ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, embodied deep ecology courses, and a growing collection of nourishing resources. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more.
Swy'n ar bron at gynnar gan Nodau pyraidd calon lawen Fe ffrigol yr adar man Tyr diranda cwyn fach genyn Sydd mewn gofyd nos a dydd Hiraeth creulon sy'n ei ganlyn Hiraeth dir ei galon bryd
There are some wonderful acts of reciprocity and cross-pollination that you can do if you are enjoying this podcast, which will help others heal and connect, inner and outer landscapes. You can subscribe, rate the show 5 stars, and you can join our Patreon community where you can actively place value in this resource and receive bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough abundant gifters to really go the extra mile with this podcast. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.
Hiraeth calon Tra rwy'n tario glad y sais Mewn atgoffion am y goefron Le fi gynt mor fwy glais Diranda cwyn fach genyn Sydd mewn gofyd nos a dydd Hiraeth creulon sy'n ei ganlyn Hiraeth dir ei galon bryd